This is Hashtag History episode 72. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Leah.
And welcome back for season 8.
Woo!
I know we technically came back for season 8 last week, but I had to say it again because just wow. Yeah. 2 years later and we're still here.
Yeah, and this is your first
This is my first episode of this season. So it still feels like the first episode sort of to me.
Yeah.
So much has happened in the 2 years since we started the podcast, one of which being this little old thing called COVID.
Yeah.
This week's topic is one we've been wanting to talk about for a long time, but during the height of the pandemic was not the time to cover it.
Yeah.
But also, we didn't want to wait until we were too far removed from the pandemic to cover it because so much of this story is going to feel very reflective and very raw and very real.
Yeah.
Because this week we are discussing Mary Mallon, more infamously known as Typhoid Mary, or as she has also been called, the most dangerous woman in America.
Wow.
She was the first person in the United States to be identified as an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. By the time it was discovered that she was a carrier of the disease, she had spread typhoid fever to over 50 people, 3 of which would die of the disease. Even after she was arrested for being a public health threat, she continued to work in the service industry, continuing to expose unknowing people to the disease.
It's just way too relevant right now.
It's so relevant. It's only going to get more relevant as I continue on. Mary Mallon, she would eventually be physically forced to quarantine, living nearly 30 years of her life in isolation before she would die. Oh my gosh, we have so much to get into.
Yes.
But first, let's get into this cocktail. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Leah. And this is Hashtag History, the podcast for both history nerds and history haters alike,
where we dive into history's greatest stories of controversy, conspiracy, and corruption.
All right, before we kick off the cocktail segment, I have to give a shout out to the cocktail sponsor of this episode. So, huge shout out to Wonder Rob and Schaff from Geek So to Speak podcast.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, they left us a little note when they sponsored the podcast saying, "Love your show. A great break for us when we are movie/TV/video game/geek newsed out. Keep up the great work. Have some drinks on us. Thank you so much, Robin Schaff."
Thank you so much. That was so nice.
Yeah.
You guys are great.
All right. So thanks to my genius co-host extraordinaire for coming up with the basis for this cocktail.
You're welcome.
Yeah, bless you.
I mean, you're welcome. Looking at it, I don't care who takes credit for it. I just want to get it in my mouth right now.
So cut to the chase. Got it.
So let's move this along.
So Rachel informed me that one of the ways that Typhoid Mary spread the disease around was not washing her hands before making ice cream with raw peaches, which I'm sure we'll dig into.
Oh my God, we're getting into all of it.
Yeah. So naturally, I took that inspiration and I ran with it. And I found the Kickin' Peach Milkshake.
Oh my God, my mouth is watering.
Yeah. So thanks to grumpy'shoneybunch.com for providing this lovely recipe for this cocktail.
Yes.
So the Kickin' Peach Milkshake contains 1.5 cups of sugar-free vanilla ice cream, or just regular ice cream, because we're not psychopaths who eat sugar-free ice cream here.
No, we do not. And this ice cream was personally made by my husband out of our ice cream maker.
When I was scooping it out, it was so soft.
He loves making ice cream and he's wonderful at it.
Yeah, he is. I've had it.
It's pretty good.
So in addition to that ice cream, it contains 3 ounces of peach schnapps. Yeah, kicker there. 2 ripe peaches, skinned and sliced, and then a cup of almond or oat milk.
And for anyone that is wondering, I am the one that cut up the peaches, and no, I did not do it historically accurately by not washing my hands.
Correct. She washed her hands. I believe twice.
Actually twice.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to be blamed for anything.
Yeah.
I have very clean hands before we start this episode.
I witnessed it. Yeah. So you place the ice cream, the schnapps, the peaches, and the almond milk all in a blender. You blend it until smooth, and then you serve with whipped cream topping and cherries if desired. We didn't do that. We don't need that.
No.
We garnished it with a slice of peach.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. I also found the Just Peachy float, which is just what it sounds like, a peach schnapps version of a root beer float. But the milkshake won out in my mind, so that's what we ended up going with. But I am considering sharing the recipe still for those who may want that instead.
Definitely.
So definitely check out our Instagram, and hopefully we can share that recipe as well.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Oh my God. I was about to start the episode.
What the hell are you doing?
I was about to start the episode.
She was about to just skip her favorite thing.
Cheers.
Cheers. I was like,
I don't know what to say other than that it evoked tears when I took my first sip.
Oh my God.
It evoked tears.
Like, truly, when you get that little, like, chunk of peach in there.
This one, for me, rating is a 15 out of 10. It's a 15 out of 10. I think it's perfect timing and stuff, too. It's, like, kind of later afternoon when we're recording. My stomach was just starting to feel, like, a little hungry. Mm-hmm. So I know it's, like, the elements, right? It's the circumstance.
Mm-hmm. But it's heaven.
But it is actual heaven. This is so flipping good.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. It's above a 10.
It's above a 10.
Yeah. Yeah, drink some before you get into it. Just take some time. Take a moment.
I mean, I did like half of it already. That's good.
Oh, God.
So good. Okay, so let's start off this episode with a picture of Mary Mallon. And I had to include this picture because she's beautiful.
Yeah, she is.
But she's also pissed the off.
She is like, how dare you be alive in my presence?
She's
giving
pissed.
Death stares.
That's beyond.
That's actually really creepy.
She zoomed in really closely on the picture. Can you breathe?
Oh, I just inhaled peach schnapps. Like, that's actually creepy.
Mm-hmm.
Her eyes are, like, very large, but, like, beautiful.
She's beautiful.
She looks almost like a cartoon.
But she mad.
Oh, she pissed. Her arms are crossed, too. She's like, F off.
Yeah. So, moving on. Now you have that image in your head.
Yeah. Beautiful, but creepy.
Angry. That's a good image to keep in your mind throughout the whole episode.
Anger.
Mary Mallon was born in 1869 in Ireland. She immigrated to the United States in 1883 when she was about 14 or 15 years old and moved in with her aunt and uncle in New York City. Very shortly thereafter, she found work as a maid before later becoming a cook. And this is something that's really important to note. Getting promoted to the position of a cook was like a really big deal. It was significantly better wages than being a maid. And as the cook, you essentially run the ship. You manage the kitchen, you handle ordering of food and supplies. You were generally the most trusted person on staff in the house.
That reminds me of Downton Abbey. I can't remember the name of the cook, but like, yeah, she was the boss.
She was the boss.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, the wages, we're talking like sometimes double to triple what you were making as, you know, a maid or a laundress or something like that. Mm-hmm. And while there aren't really any details about this in the history of Mary Mallon, I think it's safe to assume that she was a bomb-ass cook. To be elevated to that position and thereafter regularly hired by incredibly wealthy families to cook for them, like her beef Wellington must have been off the charts.
Off the
charts. To give a little background on Mallon's immigration, this definitely wasn't unique to her. It was very common for Irish women to immigrate on their own without husbands or children. In fact, by 1900, the number of Irish women immigrating to the United States exceeded the number of Irish men immigrating. And the majority of Irish women immigrating were young and single.
That reminds me of another movie, or I guess Downton Abbey isn't a movie, but Brooklyn. Did you ever see that with Saoirse Ronan or whatever?
No.
It's about a girl in the early 1900s, an Irish girl who immigrates to Brooklyn. And like, yeah, she's by herself. And it was like she stays in a dorm house with a bunch of other young women who came over without their families.
Yep.
Yeah.
Super, super common because following the famine in Ireland, many Irish women sought the work and even potential husbands here that Ireland could not offer. And this work that they found in the United States was, like I've kind of already said, more often than not as domestic servants. In the United States, amongst employed Irish women, domestic service made up 70%. In New York alone in 1860, 94.5% of working Irish women in New York were working as domestic servants. 94.5%. That is huge.
That's huge. I mean, that's all of them.
That's basically all of them.
Yeah.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
So again, Mallon's experience immigrating to the United States and taking up a job in domestic service was totally typical. What wasn't totally typical, however, was the amount of illness Mallon tended to leave in her wake. Between the years of 1900 and 1907, when Mallon was working as a cook in New York City, 7 of the 8 families she was working for ended up contracting typhoid. 7 of the 8.
And she didn't find that concerning?
I feel like we're going to have a lot of discussion later on about her acceptance of and belief of her own condition.
Okay.
We're going to get there.
Okay.
To highlight one particular family, in 1906, Mallon began working on Long Island for the family of a banker named Charles Henry Warren. The Warren family went on a little summer vacation in Oyster Bay, and Mallon came along with them. Between the dates of August 27th and September 3rd, 1906, 6 of the 11 people on this family vacation became terribly ill with typhoid fever. Now, it's really important to give some context and some history on typhoid fever, because the fact that this Soup's wealthy family in this exclusive seaside resort at Oyster Bay on Long Island came down with typhoid fever was incredibly atypical. I mean, this was the area where Teddy Roosevelt vacationed. To quote directly from Anthony Bourdain, yes, that Anthony Bourdain.
Love him.
He actually published a book about Typhoid Mary in 2001.
I did not know that.
He loved her. Like, loved her, not like he loved her, but he was fascinated by her.
Yeah.
In part of my research that I did for this episode, I was watching a documentary about her, and he was interviewed several times. He was an expert on her.
Oh my gosh.
Fascinating,
Tony.
right? He said that typhoid fever was, quote, an illness widely associated with poverty and filth, end quote. And he was right. By the late 1800s, it was understood that typhoid fever is contracted when one ingests contaminated food or water. The food or water is contaminated by Salmonella bacteria, which is bacteria that grows in your intestines and is therefore found in shit and urine. In as simple of terms as possible, it's essentially when you have a little contaminated poo-poo still on your hands or under your fingernails, and then someone ingests it.
Gross.
At a time when the public sewage system was very, very recent and in some cases still underway, particularly in those crowded, lower financial means areas, that's where you would see outbreaks of typhoid fever.
Yeah.
Construction of New York City's sewer system began in 1849, and by 1902, the majority of the city had a sewer system. The construction of a sewer system was largely motivated by the huge outbreaks of cholera and typhoid that NYC was experiencing. In the 19th century and into the early 20th century, New York City was seeing 4,000 new cases of typhoid fever a year. And typhoid fever is really serious. Symptoms include fever, diarrhea, headache, stomach pains, overall weakness, even delirium. 1 in 10 infected people were dying of the disease. So to give you an idea of how, super gross New York City was at this time and the level of sanitation that was not taking place, I'm going to show you a picture. This one is from a New York City street in 1895.
Yep.
That's wild. That's wild. That's wild.
That's sad. But yeah, let me actually describe it for our listeners. Hi. So it's Cobblestone Street, New York City. There's some kids literally playing in the gutter, which I'm assuming is has shit in it.
Yep.
And then next to them in the gutter is a dead horse.
Yes.
And they're just playing just chilling.
So wild, right?
Barefoot, mind you.
Yeah, and they're barefoot.
Uh-huh.
So wild.
Yeah.
Whew. Okay. So let's get back to this Soup's wealthy family in Oyster Bay that has it coming out of both ends. God, not funny. Again, totally atypical for a family such as this in a location such as this to get typhoid fever. So they brought in the big guns to determine what had happened here. They brought in expert investigators. One such expert was a man named George Soper, who was a sanitary engineer for the New York City Department of Health. Soper was of the belief that perhaps some clams the family had eaten were the root of the contamination, but then he learned that not all infected had eaten the clams. His mind then instantly went to the water, assuming that it must be contaminated. They ran tests on the toilets, on the sinks, on the pipes, on the faucets, everything. Soper asked for the names and physical descriptions of everyone that had been in the house when the disease began, and they all came back negative for typhoid. Someone shared with him, though, that there had been an Irish woman by the name of Mary Mallon serving as cook for the vacationing family, but Mallon had since gone missing and could not be located. The cause of the outbreak would remain a mystery until the following year.
I mean, the one person you didn't test is now missing.
Yes. And I think when I say it was a mystery, I just mean that it wasn't definitively proven because they didn't have samples from her.
Yeah.
Soper totally at this point is like, all right, I'm fairly certain I found the culprit.
Yeah, Mary.
Yes. In early 1907, a wealthy family living in a penthouse on Park Avenue became ill with typhoid. The maid and then later the daughter of this family. In fact, the young daughter would become so severely ill that she would later pass away from the disease. Soper was called in to investigate, and that's when Soper learns that the family employed a cook named Mary Mallon.
Soper, get on it. Get ahead of it, Soper. Not behind it. You don't want to be behind someone with typhoid.
You don't want to be on the backside.
Or the front, really.
Or really just...
You don't want to be near them.
6 feet distance.
6 feet.
This part of the story is pretty great. According to Soper, of course, he describes approaching Mallon in the kitchen in a way that was, these are his words here, as diplomatic as possible.
Could you imagine having this job and having to, like, come up to a cook? This is their job. This is their profession. They probably take a lot of pride in it. And be like, excuse me?
Hey.
Do you?
This is awkward.
You, like, shit and then, like, not wash your hands? And then, like, you know, serve people, and then touch
just wondering
food. And do you put your fingers in the pie?
No biggie. Just curious.
Checking.
Just checking.
Yeah.
I love that you did that little role play there because we're about to get into this dialogue between the two of them, and this is why like this part of the story is so great.
Oh my god.
So Soper approaches Mallon in the kitchen. He tells her he has reason to believe that she was spreading typhoid fever around New York City and that she must provide samples of her stool and urine for him to test.
Imagine someone approaching you being like, could I have some stool, please?
Absolutely. So exactly. So let's do the thing that we love to do on this podcast where we put ourselves in the shoes of these people in history.
Okay.
Right?
Already there.
We're already there. Mm-hmm. Because the way I see this, no matter how diplomatic Soper was, this conversation was never going to go well.
There's no way it could.
It can't. Imagine yourself in her shoes.
Like, yes, let me go. Do you have a cup?
I have never met you before. You know what I mean? Like, I've never met you before. Excuse me. What? Let's look at the time period. We're talking 1907. Only 50 years prior, give or take, did Pasteur introduce the germ theory, which proved that tiny, invisible germs were the cause of contamination and disease. Mm-hmm. We're only 50 years out from people even understanding what germs are and how diseases are spread.
Yeah.
And there are people that still don't believe that.
Uh-huh.
Much less someone like Mary Mallon that has never exhibited symptoms of typhoid fever. She certainly does not think she is a carrier of the disease because she has never exhibited symptoms of it and could therefore, under her belief and understanding, not spread it. Mm-hmm. And then finally, we've already kind of touched on this, but we must recognize that it is a natural human instinct, at least for me, for the first response to an accusation like that to be defensive, right?
Not just for you, for me.
That's my go-to response.
Like, yes, absolutely defensiveness.
A stranger barges into your kitchen and tells you he needs samples of your stool.
Excuse me?
You can off. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you can.
It's just all bad, right? Like, that was never going to be a good conversation.
No, it could.
They are both in the wrong, and they are both in the right.
Yeah, in some ways.
In some ways.
Yes.
But it gets worse because, according to Soper, not only did Mallon refuse to give the samples, but she also picked up a carving fork and began waving it at him. So here's a quote from Soper, if you can read it, Leah.
I'd love to. It did not take Mary long to react to this suggestion. She seized a carving fork and advanced in my direction. I passed rapidly down the long, narrow hall, through the tall iron gate, out through the area, and to the sidewalk. I felt rather lucky to escape.
In response to this, Soper began heavily investigating Mallon and her past employment. He found that of the 8 families that she had worked for in the past handful of years, 7 of the families had reported contracting typhoid fever. He discovered that Mallon was a healthy carrier of typhoid fever. She became the first American identified as asymptomatic, a term that was unknown to even those in the professional medical field at that time.
Yeah.
And I think, again, let's put ourselves in the shoes of these people in history. Even just this last year in 2020 with the coronavirus pandemic, there were people that had a very hard time understanding how asymptomatic people could spread the virus.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
In 2020. So throw yourself back more than 100 years ago when the concept of invisible germs is still a semi-new thing, and there are many people that still didn't accept it.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, no one had heard of spreading contamination when one had never exhibited symptoms of the disease.
Yeah.
So I like this whole thing, I don't want to villainize Mary Mallon. We'll talk about, I think we're going to have good discussions like throughout.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I don't like to villainize her because we do have to put her in this context of like,
she's the first.
She's the first identified.
Identified as asymptomatic.
So of course you don't believe it.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Right?
Yeah, you're right.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Caitlin.
How are you?
Good. You know what I'm sick of?
What?
Ted Bundy.
Jeffrey Dahmer?
Gacy?
Other well-known serial killers?
No, for real though. I'm tired of hearing about the same cases over and over and over.
Me fucking too.
That's why we created Luminol True Crime. We are a true crime, conspiracy theories,
Alien
strange happenings
podcast.
We talk.
You listen.
And then it ends. So we are Luminol True Crime, and we are here for all of those cases that you actually haven't heard of yet, which there are surprisingly a lot of them.
Every week, we choose a new theme.
Check us out. We release episodes every Wednesday. They're full length, about an hour long each, and we talk about different cases you probably haven't heard of. We have a beer. We enjoy it, and it's a lot of fun, so we think that you'll really like it.
Yeah, join us.
And listen to Luminol True Crime.
Bye, kids.
Bye, Illuminati.
So Soper tracked Mallon down to where her boyfriend was living. By this point, Soper had a really bad opinion of Mallon. It was typical and absolutely unacceptable at this time for many to look at Irish immigrants, particularly women, as these are, the quotes from the time, stupid, dirty, and unambitious. And so when he went to the apartment where she was staying, he made sure to note that, quote, it was a place of dirt and disorder. He tried again to convince her that she was a carrier of typhoid and that she needed to provide samples. She again refused.
Yeah.
And so Soper went to the health department and convinced them to bring her in. Inspector Dr. Josephine Baker, who is such a fascinating person in and of herself that maybe we need to look at later, she was one of few women in a position such as hers, lesbian, instrumental in reducing the spread of viruses in New York City, woke the city up to the mortality rates of infants, and so much more. She was tasked with bringing Mallon in if she once again refused to give samples. In normal Mary Mallon fashion, she not only refused, but also escaped out a back door and jumped over a fence in an attempt to get away.
Jeez, Mary.
I know.
Gosh.
It's like, what I was saying is like, of course you're defensive to a certain point.
Yeah, like, I don't know that I would jump over a fence. I would be defensive, but I would be like, yeah, let me prove to you. Let me give you a sample of my stool so I can prove this to you, because that's ridiculous.
Totally. Let's do this. Sure, I'll come in.
Yeah.
Let's do this thing. Anyway, the health department, they were prepared, and they had police on site and had Mallon arrested. Apparently, she put up a pretty good fight because Baker actually ended up having to sit on top of her the whole way in.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Mallon was taken to Willard Parker Hospital, and once here, her stool was tested, and indeed, it came back positive for typhoid.
Yeah.
It was also here that Mallon admitted to very rarely washing her hands. Again, for the millionth time in this episode, put yourself back in this time period in history. Hand washing was not a very common practice at this time. But still, you're nasty for that.
Yeah.
But still,
ew.
Gross.
Yeah.
Especially because it was found that a common favorite dish that Mallon made the family she cooked for was similar to this, oh my gosh, so good cocktail that we had, not having right now because we've both polished it off.
Yeah.
Favorite dish of hers was vanilla ice cream and raw peaches. So unlike many other foods that are, cooked on a hot stove and therefore, that kind of removes most germs.
Yeah.
Cutting up raw peaches in your hands, serving them raw on top of cold ice cream. It's just asking for trouble.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good. I mean, it sounds good. But...
Sounds amazing, but awful.
Yeah.
They believed the site of her typhoid infection to be her gallbladder, so they offered to remove it, but Malin said, heck no. She was still convinced she was innocent, and the death rate for surgeries, even, at this time, relatively simple ones like gallbladder, were incredibly high. Refusing to have her gallbladder removed and refusing to leave work as a cook, she was forced to quarantine on North Brother Island on March 19th, 1907. It's amazing that they could do that, right? I mean, it's just like, especially, fresh and raw off this last year, that she was forcibly quarantined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She was seen as a public health threat, and it was therefore legal to sentence her to quarantine. It also speaks to the same themes that we see today, that poor people without resources could be sentenced to quarantine without due process of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And this became a huge morality issue. Shortly after her sentence, Soper began to write about her, and the nickname Typhoid Mary became instant news. People began arguing about what was right and what was wrong. Was it right to, as Malin said in her own words, be banished like a leper and compelled to live in solitary confinement? Apparently, she was treated pretty horribly at this facility. Her stool was tested several times a week. She wasn't allowed to see an eye doctor, even though she had a paralyzed eyelid. Her medication was constantly switched up on her. Many believe that if she was just trained on how to contain the disease, aka wash your damn hands, that she would be allowed to live amongst the public once again. Malin actually had her stool independently tested several times, all of which came back negative for typhoid.
Okay, so I could see if that is true, being like, this is all a conspiracy to get me.
Mm-hmm.
To get me. I don't know.
Even some of the samples that she provided at North Brother Island were negative.
Yeah.
But, if you think some of the samples she provided were negative, but the majority were still positive.
Yes.
So in 1909, Malin sued the New York City Health Department, but the New York Supreme Court denied it. I guess one of her attorney's arguments was that they were aware of several other people just walking around New York City that were carriers of typhoid, that they were not forcibly quarantined. The health department's response to that was like, yeah, but none of those people are cooks, which was how Malin was spreading the disease.
Yeah.
After 3 years, a new commissioner of the health department named Eugene H. Porter decided that Malin should no longer be kept in quarantine, but made Malin promise that she would no longer work as a cook and that she would take the necessary steps to ensure she did not spread the disease. Again, wash your damn hands.
Yeah.
Malin began working as a laundress, but given how awful the wages were in comparison to those she was making when she was a cook, she went back to the cooking life.
Like, who took her as a cook?
What'd you say?
Like, who took her as a cook?
That is such a great question, because obviously she's infamous.
Yeah.
She's infamous at this point as Typhoid Mary. So she would use fake names such as Mary Brown to evade detection.
Okay.
Great question.
Yeah, that's weird. I mean, I truly didn't see that you were about to talk about her taking fake names.
No, that was fantastic. And so she continued to spread the disease throughout the city.
See, this is where I take some problems. Okay. I understand it's hard to get a wage as working outside of being a cook, right?
Yes.
You get paid great as a cook. But like, even if some of your tests came back negative, like you said, a lot of them are coming back positive for this. So like, let's accept that you probably have it.
Yes.
Or even if you don't, let's be safe rather than get people sick. So why, this is where I take problem.
Well, I think, so the thing with this too, because I've thought about this a lot, right? In putting together this episode of Mary Malin, like victim versus villain, right? And I think let's put the human element on her, like, the empathy of like this woman that she doesn't believe.
Yeah, she truly
to her core doesn't believe that she is the problem.
Yeah.
And also the human element of like going from a cook downgrading to a maid, less than half the wages.
Yeah.
Is that manageable? Is that feasible? Can you live in New York City like that as a single woman? So there's all like the human elements on her.
Yeah.
But exactly what you said, there's a certain level of personal responsibility. Even if you don't believe it, okay, go ahead and continue to work as a cook, but you better be scrubbing your hands till they're raw.
Yep.
Going underneath your fingernails, maybe wearing gloves or something while you're cooking.
Yeah.
Right? Like take those necessary precautions That's why this story is so fascinating to me, because it is forever the like victim versus villain. I have empathy for her, but also she is the problem.
Yes.
And she did lead to death. In 1915, there was an outbreak of typhoid at New York City's Sloan Hospital for Women. The disease infected 25 people, 2 of which would later die. This was highly unusual because hospitals are generally some of the most sanitary places on earth, right? Mm-hmm. An outbreak of typhoid in a setting such as this was unheard of. Soper was called on to investigate, and when he asked the staff who their cook was, they were like, "Oh, Typhoid Mary? Yeah, haha." And he's like, what? They're like, "Oh, no, we're just joking. That's just a joke that, we've had around the hospital for the person that we have employed as our cook," right? Little did they know how true this was.
Yeah.
Soper was given a physical description of the cook, who went by the name of Mary Brown. And upon seeing her handwriting, Soper immediately recognized it and identified it as the writing of that of Mary Mallon.
It's like, yeah, are you laughing now? Laughing now? Chuckles? It's actually typhoid.
New HR policy. No one gets nicknames.
Yeah.
Apparently, Mallon tried to run away again, but was eventually caught and forced back into quarantine on North Brother Island on March 27th, 1915.
And again, this is the point in time where I'm like, okay, now there's another outbreak. There's no more denying it.
I know.
And I kind of disagree with you a little bit. Okay, she doesn't believe it to her core. To her core, she doesn't believe it. And that's just denial to me.
Yeah.
Because there's so many things. That's like saying it's okay to believe COVID isn't real because they believe it to their core, even though they're presented with fact. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even though people are presented with facts showing that this is a real thing and a real problem, and here's the statistics and here's science, and
instead it's just denial.
So just because they truly don't believe it's real, that's acceptable. I don't think it is.
No, that was great, and I realize what I'm about to say now is contradictory to what I was saying before, because it is in line with what you're saying. The other thing I've always thought about her too is all the research that I've done continues to say that she, to the day she died, she denied it and retained her innocence.
Yeah,
but. And so this is like a piece that I don't know. Was it common for cooks to move through families very quickly? Because it does appear as though families would get sick and then they couldn't find Mary Mallon.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Clearly she knew something was up, because after someone gets sick, she just disappears.
Mm-hmm. And they could never find her again.
So, yeah. I don't know. Suspicious.
It's suspicious. Many people, so this, the second quarantine that she's undergoing, many people, including Soper, reported that she was very different this second time around. She was much more subdued, the fire she once had in her was no longer there. And any sympathy that the public had for Mallon had since disappeared after this more recent outbreak.
Yeah.
And Mallon kind of faded to the background. About 3 years into her sentence, when they were no longer concerned about her being a flight risk, she was allowed to take little day trips to the mainland, and she always returned right on time to the little one-story cottage waiting for her on the island. Mary actually made some friends while on the island and took up a job working in the laboratory. And then, and that's another part of the story is, did she eventually give in, maybe because she did accept some personal responsibility? I don't know. Or was it like
her soul was broken. She was broken.
But then I also think she had to fight her whole life, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As a young woman in a foreign country, just trying to make ends meet. Was there at some point a piece of her that I'm not saying that quarantine is an ideal situation at all, of course, because you're literally forced. She didn't have a choice. Here's your one-story cottage out on this island, and that's it. But was there a piece of her that at one point accepted, if nothing else, I don't have to fight to make my rent every month? Or
yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
She would remain on the island for another 23 years. She would suffer a stroke in 1932 and was virtually confined to the hospital after that, unable to walk. It would be another 6 years before she died of pneumonia on November 11th, 1938, at the age of 69. She was cremated and her ashes were buried in the Bronx. She died with virtually no one by her side. Just as she came to America all on her own, so did she leave.
Okay, that's sad.
And according to records, her stool continued to be regularly tested throughout her final 2 decades on the island, and it continued to come back positive for typhoid fever.
Yeah.
It would not be until 1948 that an antibiotic treatment was developed to combat Salmonella typhi. Today, typhoid fever is extremely rare in more developed countries. In the United States, there are about 400 cases detected annually.
Could you imagine how embarrassing it would be to be one of those 400 cases?
Okay, and that's the other thing. And that's what I always think about her, too, is like, that is embarrassing.
Oh, it's embarrassing.
It's embarrassing. And I want to acknowledge that healthy carriers of typhoid, it doesn't always necessarily mean that like every time you take a shit, you don't wash your hands, because it's like scrubbing under your fingernails.
Yeah.
It's washing your hands for 2 minutes at a time instead of 30 seconds. Or, you know what I'm saying? It's like, this isn't to say that Mary Mallon never washed her hands. And it isn't to say that other carriers of typhoid never wash their hands.
Yeah.
It's a conundrum.
It is a conundrum. I love it. I love it. It makes you question, you know,
Morality.
Victim versus
Villain. It is generally accepted that Mary Mallon infected just over 50 people, but the number could certainly be much greater than this. Like we've said this entire episode, Typhoid Mary continues to be a conversation of much debate. She continued to believe in her own innocence until the day she died. So was she a victim or was she a villain?
maybe a little bit of both.
Can she be both? I think she is.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Hashtag History.
We will share the pictures that we discussed on the episode to our Instagram, and all sources used to put together this episode can be found on our website at hashtaghistory-pod.com.
Subscribe to us on whatever podcast platform you use, share about us with your family and your friends, and then give us a rate and review.
And circling back to Instagram, be sure to check us out on there at #history_podcast. We also have started a TikTok, so check us out on there at #history, all one word.
And come join us over on Patreon, where for as little as $1 a month, you can help support our books and booze supply. You also get access to some behind-the-scenes content, weekly Hashtag Hangout episodes, and we mail you cards and stickers.
And so much more.
And I mean, yeah, there's so much more than that. That's just the
Tip of the iceberg.
The tip of the iceberg. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Check the mic and make sure it sound right, boys.
1, 2, 3.
Killing it. Killing it. I can't even hear your clap because that's how in sync we are. Okay.
Could you imagine having this job? Sorry, I'm eating a peach.
Salmonella typhi. Oh my God.